Hello, everybody, and welcome back to City Chats. I'm Joyce Dooley, Senior Research and Content Analyst for Z-Prime. We're going to be talking today all about transforming transportation. Transportation and mobility are key components to any smart city, and cities are looking toward a variety of solutions and tools to overcome embedded inequities in infrastructure and current transportation models. But are they really effective? Today, we're joined by Ruthbea Clarke with IDC, and we're going to be talking about funding, micromobility, electrification, equity, and more. Ruthbea, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. Very excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, before we get too far into things, I really would love to hear more about you and your passion for smart cities.
Sure. Well, who isn't passionate about smart cities? I don't know. It's the best thing going. But no, seriously, I really actually began in the nonprofit sector in state-funded government nonprofit work. And so my dream was really to be an executive director around social services and equity and public good. And somewhere in there, I really got interested in the idea of technology for good. And this is a really long time ago, so not everybody was thinking about technology like that. I got a little bit made fun of in business school for being a do-gooder. But I did. I went and got a social work degree and a business degree, and in there just started thinking about, the markets of what was happening around technology. I ended up in Silicon Valley, and after that, I came to IDC, and I was sort of given the opportunity to start a Smart Cities and Communities program after we had done some consulting projects around that. So this was in 2011, and not a lot of people were talking about smart cities. It was really, really the beginning discussions. But I think if you're passionate about people and you're passionate about the environment, you cannot not be passionate about cities and communities, because that's where the majority, if not all, mostly the people live, even if they're small communities, right? So I think that's where the world's population and growth is happening, and that's where we just can have so much impact on people's quality of life. And as we start to think more about the environment, of course, that's where a lot of the environmental issues around carbon emissions originate. A lot of things happening with transportation, cities, and other things. So I think that all combines to, make this a tremendously exciting, dynamic topic that impacts a lot of people.
I couldn't agree more. I absolutely love, pretty much all the things that you just said. I think being a fellow person who is passionate about sustainability and the environment and communities, and, I feel like there's so much room here that everybody can participate in smart cities. And, that in order to really achieve what we want, that's going to have to happen at some point. Everyone's going to have to be on board and on the same page. And it seems like it's becoming more and more possible, which is fantastic. Because again, like 2011, 2016 is when I got into smart cities. And even then there wasn't as much conversation about it. And now it almost feels like it's very much in the public space, which is inspiring and helps, I think, people like us feel like we're doing the right thing about, the work that we do and what we want to build. So one of the more exciting things about this sector is the activity that's really starting to ramp up due to the Infrastructure Act funding. Can you share more about that and what it means for transportation in America?
Yeah, I think what's incredibly interesting, and sometimes people are like, why are we talking about this policy so much? But really, a lot of the gating factors that we talked about with cities and municipalities was around money. And doing huge infrastructure projects cost a ton of money, and they required a lot of investment from stakeholders. And as we've seen from ARPA and from now the Infrastructure Act, that kind of piece of the equation is presenting its own challenges, because we're sort of awash with money, and that presents its own issues. But that whole thing of really not having any funding to do some of these things has really it sort of just disappeared in some ways. So I think that's, and somebody said that I was using the word unprecedented too much, so I won't say that, but I do think it's this historic moment in time where we put forth an infrastructure funding bill that has not happened with, almost $500 billion in brand new funding. And that is all going mainly to cities and states around transportation, water, energy and power, environment, and it's really focused on equity and resilience. And so I just think it kind of hits on all the issues that I think we're talking about in smart cities, and is really part of this discussion around sort of rebuilding, reinvesting, thinking about, our communities in different ways. So I think that's what makes it really exciting. That's one of the things I should say. I think there's other things that are exciting too, but I think those are some of the big issues. The equity issue, the focus on infrastructure, the focus on transportation, and really the size of, the new money that's coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are going to be on the same page about a lot of things, right? There might be some disagreements about how that money should be spent, but at the same time, like, it's all going to great places. And I agree. I think it is unprecedented. And the biggest hurdles, right, is how do people pay for this, right? Like, you are typically dealing with, smaller cities that don't have access to the big funding grant opportunities because of their size, or because they don't have the right partners involved because they're too small. This really opens up the floodgates for cities of all sizes to really take advantage and improve their infrastructure and improve transportation across the board. And it's something that we've so desperately needed. I mean, I don't want to know how many years Deloitte has ranked our infrastructure at like a D-
D or whatever, right?
But I remember that going back, to 2013 or so. So it's been coming for a long time, and it's finally here. And so it is exciting. But I think we'll also agree on this point that just because the money is here does not mean that those problems go away. That, having a real plan for what you're going to do with that funding is more critical, I think, than just whether or not it exists.
Well, and to the point, in the US, the state and local governments, I think, control or operate 75% of the US infrastructure. So we are talking about a tremendous impact just on infrastructure in general.
Yeah.
But I do think, to your point, we have a tight labor market. Municipalities and states, they already had a tremendous amount of job openings going into the pandemic. And now we're sort of giving them this tremendous opportunity, but it actually requires resources, right? You need people who can design projects, people who can apply for grants, people who can take the money in and track it, people who can do the procurement and the permitting for the new build outs and the inspections and vet new suppliers. So, some of the cities I've talked to actually are fairly overwhelmed. There's a little bit of burnout after the pandemic, and, there's still money that hasn't been spent from other, funding areas. So I do think it does present challenge. It's not just like happy fairy dust. It presents some real complex issues. And I think that's what you're alluding to as well. It's not just the money's there and now everything's going to be great. These are complicated issues, and it's complicated to have a lot of money, especially if you're really under-resourced.
Yeah, well, and figuring out how to spend that money is also a challenge, right? Because, having money in the bank is great, but prioritization and tracking and all the things that you talked about as well. I mean, it's just, this is a complex issue. It has been for quite some time. We're getting maybe a mechanism to help move things forward. But again, if you don't have those fundamentals in place, you're going to be a missed opportunity, which would be a real shame. So, hopefully there's some real guidelines put in place to help cities take full advantage and be successful as a result.
Can I mention those guidelines that I just think is worth noting? And I'll admit, I don't know how many cities or states have done this, but, the White House came out and basically said every state and every community should have an infrastructure act lead. Like, they should have a dedicated program manager to coordinate this effort. Now, I understand that that's a challenge if you don't have, if you're have a lot of openings and it's a tight labor market and there's a lot of people out there, who are being wooed away from government work. But to me, that is actually a really, really important piece of advice. This is like managing a huge enterprise-wide project for a city and liaising with the state and liaising with the federal government agencies. So to me, that seems to be a really good first place to start in terms of people, even if they're small, is having somebody there who's kind of a point person around this topic and the money.
I think that's great. I think that's great advice. To shift gears a little bit and focus more specifically on transportation, you had said previously in a conversation I think we had a couple months back that, there's a coalition of forces that's impacting transportation from an innovation standpoint. And that sounds really badass. So, can you kind of elaborate on this coalition of forces and what that means?
Okay, you may be making it sound way more exciting than I meant to. But I think, so I'm an analyst and you're an analyst. We cover market trends, right? So we're always looking at what's happening, what was happening, what's going to happen, and trying to really make sense of it all. And so a lot of times we were talking about little things we hoped for, like, let's talk about sustainability and see if people could come to some sort of large scale agreement around climate resilience or climate change, or let's talk about the cloud. And it would be nice if people were sort of adopting, thinking about cloud technologies or whatever. And so what I feel like happened around the pandemic and maybe starting before is all of a sudden, all these norms really dramatically shifted. And that along with the funding that we just talked about. So you've kind of got the trend of nobody has enough staff or enough resources. We suddenly have money. We have all this old technology and technical debt where things are really not doing what they're supposed to do. We're focusing suddenly really strongly on the cities around equity and accessibility and the whole user experience and the environment, which means that you have to have modern digital services because you can't use your old stuff to do the things they need to do.
Right.
And then on top of all that, you really have these changing norms around working from home. I don't want to go to a government office. I want to do everything remote. I want digital services. So when you take that together, like money, changing norms, no jobs, old technology, and this real new focus on sustainability, I think that the conversations are completely different. Maybe not everywhere and not perfectly, but in the US, very, very leaps and bounds different around really coalescing around some of these ideas and not necessarily within cities arguing about them so much.
Yeah. I mean, those are all really great points and they're sticky points for everybody. But I think that is kind of what makes it badass. The more confined something is, or the more, obstacles, the more creative you have to be. And I think the better things are produced as a result of that sort of compression that's going on. And so it's uncomfortable, right? The nature of industrial revolutions and the fact that these things are happening at scale on top of all of these other layers and elements that are going on, it's uncomfortable for everybody. But what it's really going to bring about is where the real gaps are. And those are the real opportunity points. So, I don't want to overly, make this positive, but, because it is difficult and it sucks sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just real. It sucks.
Yeah.
But through that, we can see some real transformation occur and pull us into the smart city, the future that we've all been talking about for over a decade and then some, right? Because smarter cities concepts have been around for quite a while. So this is just now finally coalescing into the opportunity to make them a reality.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at it, when I used to go and talk to different cities, depending on the region, I actually did not use, let's say, the term sustainability or the environment at all.
Right.
Right. And it was very, very a little bit tenuous to talk about equity. Imagine in 10 years, I don't think I can talk to a single, it doesn't matter, red, blue, whatever. Everybody is talking about digital equity, equity, accessibility, and resilience. And that's really big for the US. And I also think the shift has been, I mean, governments have always cared about their citizens. They've always cared about their community. That's why people are in government. I think they get a very bad rap around bad rap about not caring. I don't think that's true at all. But that's very different from caring about the experience overall, right? Maybe before it was like, I care about you, but I'm going to be efficient and we're going to do this and we're going to make sure no one's cheating and we're going to be a little bureaucratic. And now it's much more like, you know what, we could make this enjoyable. We could make this super convenient. We care about how you're interacting with us. So I think that's also, I don't think anyone's not talking about that either. And that's also very, I think, like, wow, in a decade to suddenly go to that incrementally, step by step over time, I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be involved, and we're having much like you were talking about, some groundbreaking discussions, or the fact that everybody's having these conversations, is a great start. We need to be careful that this doesn't end up where we all talk about it and there's a lot of flurry of activity. There's the actual delivery of services as a result of these conversations, but we weren't having these discussions before. And every community is going to determine that these things are going to line up differently for them, but they're going to exist in some capacity. And, there's really truly dedicated people who care about making them, real, which is, another really exciting thing.
Can I just mention something really quickly? I'm going to get this wrong, so forgive me, City of Boston, but there was a while back, the City of Boston basically came out with like a playbook or a handbook about being friendly, like being a smiling, happy, friendly, first line, government to the citizen connection point. And I just think this is an example of like these small, meaningful changes that cities are doing. So a lot of times we're talking about these enormous issues, and we just have to recognize that the change is still going to be completely incremental the whole entire way. So there's a lot of small, I think, changes happening. And there might be something as simple as the city coming forward and saying, okay, guys, our policy now and what we'd like to do going forward for our culture is to like be super happy and pleasant and smiley when people come talk to government. And it's like, that's kind of changes people's day, a lot of people's day.
Yeah. I mean, some of these things are as simple as that, because most of the time when people are dealing with city services anyways, there's a problem involved.
Right. They're mad.
And cities, and in order to protect themselves, I think, from a lot of issues and liabilities, come across as these very distinct institutions, right? Like, we are a city, and it's very serious. And it should be taken seriously because it is a city. But at the same time, like, if you are within a community, there should be that camaraderie, or that, hey, we're in the same place together, and this is our home together, and this is how it functions. But, let's break down some of those barriers, because just by changing how you engage with people, much like you said, can transform someone's day. And changing the perception of how accessible and relatable your city is can make a huge impact to how people interact with officials and all kinds of things. So the ripple effect of that is quite amazing.
And it fosters more trust.
Which is so critical, especially to get almost any of these things off the ground. So I think, when we're talking about transportation stuff, we can't not talk about electrification and what EVs mean to transportation of the future. What are some of your thoughts on what's happening in the EV space, and how can cities be prepared for what's coming?
Yeah, so I think this is a really nice flow through from talking about the Infrastructure Act, which really put a lot of effort into helping states and cities build out EV charging infrastructure. So if you think about, and Joyce, this better than me probably. One of the big issues for people, not only like they felt like they couldn't buy an EV car, which is now also changing, but they had a lot of range anxiety, right? Like, oh, can I actually go anywhere in my car and not be stuck? And there's no charging places and I don't know what to do. So this is sort of trying to solve that, right? We're, again, coalition of forces. You can afford maybe your electric vehicle now. And now you might actually not just be sort of charging at home. We see a lot of things happening with parking lots and municipal governments, and they're going to happen on freeways. So I think that is a big tie-in back to the Infrastructure Act with really helping to build out that EV charging infrastructure. And I think that also puts a lot of thinking that needs to happen for municipalities as well in terms of how they do that and what the business model might be. Mm-hmm. And then I also think if we're really going to think about sustainability, we have to start to think about government fleets. And so I think this goes into thinking about, well, what happens not just to the residents that are having EVs, but how can whole governments, and people are starting to do this one by one, but like eventually your whole fleet is going to be, electric. What does that mean? What does that mean for how you charge, how you use the vehicles, what they're capable of, because they're not combustion, they have a lot more software. So I think there's other things that are transformative about EVs that are not just about electrification in itself. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, this is not a simplistic thing, right? It's not, it might be simple to plug in a vehicle, but it doesn't mean that the infrastructure required or the processes around, managing this transformation is going to be simple at all. Right. One of the things that's very exciting that we're working on is we're collaborating with the city of San Antonio and CPS Energy on an SA Drive event, Drive Electric event. And that's part of the Drive Week that's going on. And it's all about education and awareness. And so there's discussions around fleets, and there's also community opportunities for engagement. And I think more and more cities are trying to figure out how to plug in to those kinds of conversations and really, make a stand on what electric vehicles can do. And a lot of this is going to seem aspirational right now because the required infrastructure to really do mass adoption just isn't there yet. But if you don't put the intention out there now, like the infrastructure is never going to catch up that way without the demand required.
Yeah, and you're right. Like it's complex, right? There's all the things about the grid, right? Usually the grid, there's not a lot happening at night. And now suddenly with EVs, if people are charging their cars at night, it has a whole different way of thinking about, power in itself and energy transformation. So I do think it is so broad, but fundamentally, again, starting small, we're just starting to think about what's possible and starting to put some infrastructure in place. And I think that's amazing. And I also think there's other technologies which are, battery swapping and road charging. And I mean, this is like going to change this is also going to, like, we're not just going to plug in eventually, right? It's totally going to change going forward, which will also change transportation. And we're also going to have this bi-directional charging, right? Like your car could charge your house. So I just think that we say EV, but it's almost like a misnomer when you actually think about societal impact. And I feel like autonomous vehicles make people think of huge societal changes and impact, but electric vehicles haven't yet. And I think that's part of what needs to get into people's minds, is it probably is a very similar type of big impact transformative.
Change. I mean, it's going to be like EV to X kind of concepts, right? EV to everything and what it can do. And I don't know why it hasn't captured the minds of so many people, maybe because electric vehicles in some capacity have been around for a while. But the possibility of it being accessible to people who are in multifamily homes and, who are, I think too, also just generationally speaking, right? Like moving from muscle cars and heavy duty trucks into heavy duty trucks, but that are environmentally friendly and also faster. Really cool stuff that's going on. So the cultural shifts required in addition to just the technological advancements. To go back a little bit to one of the things you were talking about that keeps you interested or brought you to your passion of smart city stuff is, technology for good. So with the digital tools that are available, to kind of address the physical constraints of existing infrastructure, how are cities approaching those kinds of things? And do you have any examples of what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when we think about transportation, which is when you think of the US highway infrastructure, it was actually designed to be a racial segregationist tool. I mean, in many ways, where we put highways and roadways was actually purposeful to separate out groups of people in different ethnicities and races, right? So I think one of the things when we think about physical segregation versus via roadways is the fact that it's actually really segregating out certain parts of the population and, removing access to a lot of great city services and opportunities. So the fact of the matter is we're not going to rip all those roadways up. Like, I think that's not really the issue. So how do we use different types of roadways and different types of transportation and different opportunities? Can I just ask you, is my connection unstable? Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, if you want to restate about the physical segregation, we can maybe try that again.
Okay, yeah, because you started to blink very slowly and I was like, I think I might be slowing down on my side.
Yeah, it definitely got sticky.
Okay. But that's sort of what you're mentioning about the physical segregation with roadways, right? That's sort of what you're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'll start over on that one. So I guess when we think about the US and what's so interesting with our road infrastructure is that we sort of specifically designed our highways to be segregationist, right? They were designed to keep communities separate and different races separate and different ethnic groups separate. So sometimes people don't like to really acknowledge that fact, but all the things we're dealing with around road infrastructure now, a lot of times in cities, is because there's highways that run through cities that are specifically leaving some people out and making it harder for them to get to central business districts. So the first thing is we have to acknowledge that that's a reality and that we can't rip up all these roadways. Mm-hmm. So there have to be other alternative ways that will really start to be innovative around this. And I don't think it's actually rocket science. I mean, I'm not a transportation planner, right? Like, I'm mainly an urban technologist. But the fact of the matter is there's lots of other ways if you just put them in place. So it's shocking oftentimes when you think there's not a lot of late night buses, or there's not other bus systems, or the bus stops are really far away, or they're really hot and they're not shaded. There's a lot of real physical things that we can do. And I also think, just from the technology side and micromobility, there's a tremendous amount of work that can be done to make all of this dynamic. Mm-hmm. So we don't need actual physical set bus stops if people have apps and they can sort of say where they are on demand and they can understand where sort of free floating transportation options are. So we can really think about this very flexible, dynamic type of arterial micromobility offering. Even though it's car-based or bus-based, we can still kind of do that and offer that for a lot of people. And we've seen that in some smaller towns, like I think Wilson, North Carolina, did this whole thing where they basically put a little virtual bus stops everywhere and let a whole bunch of people, get to work and get to their hospital visits, and this really new dynamic kind of way of doing public transportation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't agree with you more about all of those things. And, we have to acknowledge the limitations that we have put in place, over time, right? And a lot of these things are just self-perpetuated at this point. Yeah. But recognizing that those things exist and that we have the opportunity to alter that and to be more equitable and to be more accessible in how we're incorporating transportation solutions into the communities. And leveraging technology or processes or whatever new innovations we're, wanting to deploy is critical. And, having not just a plan for how you're going to spend the money, but a real plan for what is going to happen with that funding that's coming down. Like, if you're not addressing the inequities in your community, you're not looking hard enough. and you don't have the right people at the table.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly crucial as well. This is about the time to wrap up, but do you have any like last minute thoughts or things that you want, like final thoughts that you want to share with us on transforming transportation in America?
I think transportation is critical infrastructure. As we've talked about, it's not going anywhere the way it physically is sitting in our world for the most part. So what we have to really do is I think there's a lot of pent up innovation and pent up demand for new ideas that's happening in cities right now. So I think we need to go with that, even if it's small, little changes or small things you test out, that can lead to really big things and big changes. So I guess I feel like we are rethinking almost everything. Like, who would have thought of a virtual bus stop or an on-demand public bus, right? So the world is kind of really open in terms of the tech tools that could support these things. And as long as you said, I really liked your point, you have to just have a plan and you have to have the right people at the table. So you really think through all the unintended consequences and you really make sure that your solution ends up equitable and fair and doing what you want it to do. And if you do that, I think there's just so many exciting things that could happen.
I mean, I think that for a couple of urban technologists and nerds that we are, this is prime time to be involved in this industry and what it means for communities. And I am certain that you and I could probably talk about these things in perpetuity. Thank you for joining with me today and sharing all of your wonderful expertise.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to having you back on the show at some point.
That sounds great, Joyce. It was really great to talk to you and hear what you had to say as well. So thank you for having me.
Anytime. Thanks, Ruthbea.
Thank you.